This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Love this podcast? Support this show through the Acast supporter feature. It's up to you how much you give, and there's no regular commitment. Just hit the link in the show description to support now.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy to see if you could save when you bundle your home and auto policies. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states.
Ready to pop the question? The jewelers at BlueNile.com have got sparkle down to a science with beautiful lab-grown diamonds worthy of your most brilliant moments. Their lab-grown diamonds are independently graded and guaranteed identical to natural diamonds, and they're ready to ship to your door. Go to BlueNile.com and use promo code LISTEN to get $50 off your purchase of $500 or more. That's code LISTEN at BlueNile.com for $50 off. BlueNile.com, code LISTEN.
A little self-care can go a long way, especially amidst the hustle and bustle of the holidays. That's where Vegamore comes in. Trusted by millions, Vegamore is all about giving your hair the love and care it deserves. With their vegan and cruelty-free formulas, you can nourish and revitalize your strands while indulging in some much-needed pampering. Because let's face it, who couldn't use a bit more me time this time of year? Go to vegamore.com/ACAST, code ACAST. That's vegamour.com/ACAST, code ACAST.
This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale. I am a writer and film critic, and today I'm going to be talking to another writer and film critic, Jason Bailey. He's written a number of books on Pulp Fiction, Woody Allen, Richard Pryor, and his latest book is called Fun City Cinema, New York and the Films That Made It, spanning a century almost of cinema, and telling the story of the films and how they were made and shot in the city, about the city, the various difficulties they had, and also linking it to the history of the city itself. It's a really fascinating read, and it will enrich your knowledge and your enjoyment of some of the best films ever made, from Midnight Cowboy to King Kong, French Connection, Taxi Driver, and including a few stinkers like Death Wish, which we do deal with. If you like the episode, please remember to like, subscribe, spread the word. You know what to do. If you want to, you can follow me on Twitter at drjonty, DRJONTY. But before you do any of that, please enjoy the conversation. Yeah, that was one of the best breakfasts I've ever had. Was the breakfast in that hotel? It was just like,
oh my God,
I'd get up early and be in there for an hour or two.
Yeah, no, I never had to eat lunch because I would just like time that breakfast late enough in the morning and just completely fill my stomach until about 6 o'clock. I never had to eat lunch on that entire trip. Yeah, that was an amazing. The idea that you can like eat regular breakfast stuff and then also all these like dumplings and all this other stuff. Yeah.
That's my absolute, because that was my third time in China, and that's my revelation from China was there's no such thing as breakfast. You can just eat normal food for breakfast. And when you think about it, it's like, why not? Why not just have like an ordinary meal, but just have it as a first meal rather than this bloody... Because we just eat like children at breakfast for some reason. Well, listen, I've finished reading your book, and I thought I was really impressed. And I've got to say I have to say as well that your book has already featured on the podcast before, because Mark Harris in the episode That was his recommended book.
Because I'd made sure to listen. I mean, I always try to catch Mark whenever he's on things, and I can tell you more about what a tremendous asset it was to know Mark in writing this book. But, I would have listened regardless, but the fact that you had sort of flagged it as like, you may want to hear what Mark has to say. And I mostly listen to podcasts while I'm walking. So I was walking to the train that morning. I was on my way to a screening in Manhattan, and it nearly brought tears to my eyes, just like walking down the street, like misty eyed, to hear someone who is such an inspiration to me and whose work was so important to me volunteer such nice things. You know what I mean? Because like he blurbed the book, but that's, you can always write off a blurb as like, well, he's a nice guy and he's doing me a favor, but to like volunteer such kind things, like that really, really meant a lot to me.
Yeah, no, it was great to hear. And what he said really stood up when I was reading it. I was thinking about what he said about how this is sort of like a really interesting style of book as well, in the way it incorporates history. And I mean, my experience of New York is I visited one time for like about 4 or 5 days, must have been about 10, 15 years ago. And it was in the middle of the summer, and we got in late. So we basically went straight to the hotel we had dinner and then went to the hotel and slept. Got up early the next morning, went into, the classic, going the subway and went to Times Square. And as we're coming out of the subway, there's just these drifting clouds of rain going in between the skyscrapers. And it was just that classic reaction of, my God, this is the movie. This is the movie. This isn't a place. It's still a movie,
It's a very cinematic place. Yeah.
Yeah. Are you a born and bred New Yorker or?
I am not. I was born and raised and spent my first 30 years in Wichita, Kansas.
Right.
Which is a very different place to be and a way of living. And when I was 30, my wife and I moved to New York, and I've lived in New York for the past 15 years. So like those are the only two places I've ever lived are Kansas and New York City.
Right. And so Kansas, very sort of, what would it be, very rural, or was it a small town? Or?
There are rural areas. There are a lot of small towns, and I've spent some time in small towns. We lived in Wichita, which is the biggest city in Kansas, but is still, in the grand scheme of things, not a huge place, not a metropolis by any stretch, but a good sized, diverse community, fairly big, fairly well. But like, here's always, I feel like the best way to sort of describe, like we got some of the indie movies like about 4 months. But I mean, it's like, It's that sort of market. So, and we're about a 3-hour drive from Kansas City, which was a larger market. So, we could take a road trip if I wanted to see something sooner, but always knew that I wanted to be in a bigger place. Always knew I wanted to kind of go to New York or LA eventually. And I think the New York movies that I grew up watching were a huge part of that, of wanting to go there and ultimately deciding that was where we needed to be.
Yeah, so many big decisions and so many ways we think about the world. Well, I don't know about you, but personally, it's all movies. It's all movies.
Absolutely. Yes. 100%. And, in retrospect, I'm not, I'm not sure when that all started or if there's sort of a specific point at which the fascination began, but certainly as sort of a teen, preteen, 12, 13, 14, when you're really becoming kind of ravenous about movies. So yeah, so I was really drawn to sort of 70s cinema and a lot of those being New York movies. And like, if you're my age, when I'm like 12, 13, 14, that's still very much the video store era. And that was how you fed that cinephilia, that I, especially during the summer when I wasn't expected to have a job yet, just like going to my neighborhood video store and coming home with an armload of tapes every couple of days. And that was, I think, the moment at which I sort of immersed myself into all of that, into, things like Pelham 123 and Dog Day Afternoon and Mean Streets and Taxi Driver and all the Scorsese stuff. He was huge for me. And I guess really that period was, I didn't intend it. I wasn't saying I want to watch a bunch of New York movies, but those for whatever reason, maybe because of contrast, because there was nothing more different from, Wichita, Kansas circa late 80s than New York in the 70s. But for whatever reason, those tended to be the films that I was kind of drawn to.
And when did you start transferring that sort of passion and that cinephilia into, the idea of writing about movies?
it was a weird path for me, I think. I don't know. I from that age or even earlier, I knew I loved movies and wanted to do something with them. But as, again, This is very much about sort of the moment that all of this is happening. This is, early 90s when the indie film scene is exploding. And so initially I very much wanted to be a filmmaker. I sort of was reading all about, Quentin Tarantino and Robert Rodriguez, and Allison Anders and all of these, young filmmakers who were Kevin Smith especially, who were scraping together just like a tiny bit of money and charging things and making these tiny but vibrant movies. And for a long time that was sort of the path that I had put myself on. I started writing screenplays in high school, feature-length screenplays. I started making features in college, and then into my 20s made a total of like 9 or 10 features and handful of shorts. But simultaneously, I had started also writing about film, not intending that to ultimately be the profession, not intending that to be sort of the final goal, just because it was something I enjoyed. And so I started writing for kind of alt weeklies in my hometown. There were a series of 3 sort of underground artsy, because there are, I think just about any community where you have, more than a couple hundred people, there's going to be an arts community. There's going to be some kind of a scene. And so I started writing film criticism very casually, very, just kind of off the cuff around that same time in college, and continued that through my 20s, while maintaining this sort of goal of being a filmmaker, of being the next Quentin or what have you. And sort of followed both of those tracks all through my 20s. But by the time I hit 30 or so, and I had a couple of real opportunities where if the film had been up to snuff, it feels like it should have broken through, and it didn't. And that sort of awkward moment that you have to have really, when you're 30, running around with a video camera and, making movies for a few $100, isn't cute anymore. Like it doesn't have the same charm as when you're a college kid. And also it's a matter of, becoming an adult and sort of facing your shortcomings and understanding what you're good at and what you're not. And also whether you love something enough to keep doing it, and what I discovered as a filmmaker was that I really liked screenwriting, and I really liked working with actors, and I really liked editing. But the process of actually being on a film set, I discovered fairly early on, was not an atmosphere that was conducive to my temperament. I found it's incredibly stressful, and having to sort of work on the fly like that and deal with all of, with all the things that can go wrong, and adjusting accordingly is sort of the opposite of what I do well. Like I am a planner and I am a structurer and I am and I don't respond well to sort of last minute adjustments as a person. So I just reached this moment where we'd kind of made the last one of these films that we'd sort of poured all of our resources into, and it didn't really go anywhere. And in the meantime, I'd been doing this film writing and taking it more and more seriously and taking more and more pride in it. And after we moved to New York and it became much harder to make a film for nothing, I started taking that more seriously and doing it more. And then in 2009, I went to my first film festival. It was the first time I'd ever covered a film festival as a critic. And I came home after the first day and I told my wife, I said, I think this is what I should be doing instead. Like the experience of going and watching films all day and then going home and writing about all of them in that sort of like mad rush of festival coverage. I was like, I think this is what I should do. And my wife, who is very practical, said, okay, well, here's how we should do that. And we had initially moved to New York because she had gotten into the graduate program in journalism at NYU. And she works in news. She's a cable news producer. And so she'd been through that program, but she had been aware of this other program in the same school called the Cultural Reporting and Criticism Program. And she said, I think you should do this, as opposed to like getting, a master's in film criticism or something like that, because this was more focused on sort of a broad range of critical writing and reporting and sort of all of the things you have to be able to do now to make a living as a film journalist. And so I looked into that program, and it looked really good. And, a lot of the writers that were in the syllabus were people I was already reading and admiring. And so I applied for that program and a couple others, but I got into that one, and that was the switch. That was the pivot into that. That was a very long-winded answer to your question, which I hope was okay.
No, that's great. It's so interesting to hear of everybody's paths, because the one thing I've noticed from doing these podcasts is everybody's got a different answer. Everybody's gone in a totally different way.
Right. No, it's not like being a doctor where there's this very set path. Like you go and you study these things and you go to this graduate school and you get these degrees and then you do this. Like it's everyone's journey to this is so erratic, which I think is
I fully approve of doctors having quite a structured way
of 100%
of approaching it.
100%.
I think maybe it's because it's one of these jobs which is so much related to a passion. It's a bit like, it's hard to justify sometimes to people, because it's like, well, you like movies and you watch movies and you write about movies. I mean, come on, what's the catch here? Yeah, there's so many people I think everybody has a different path in, to finally actually doing it in some sort of professional capacity.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's sort of why I value my relationships with other critics so much, because we are all coming to these things with such different backgrounds and perspectives and sort of ideas of what we're looking for, and different levels of appreciation for the work. Like I'm one of my best friends in the critical community is Bilge Ebiri, and Bilge started out as a filmmaker as well. And I think that one of the reasons I think that certainly for myself, I can't speak for him, but one of the reasons I think I am a more forgiving critic, more inclined to grant a filmmaker the benefit of the doubt, is because I know exactly how hard this is. I know the sort of magical confluence of events that has to come together in order for a movie to be watchable, to like get completed, much less be great. And so sometimes I am a bit of a soft touch. Sometimes I'll look at sometimes my ratings of a film compared to some of my critical colleagues, and I'm a little bit of a softer touch, but I have such sympathy for that process that I think that really does inform how I view a finished work.
I've been thinking about this a lot recently, actually, about how the idea of am I going to be a harsh critic and people are going to respect my views because God, nothing seems to please him, or am I going to be a friend of mine who and a fellow journalist said, "Oh, who's that chap over there? The one who likes everything." And,
yes,
I won't tell you who that is.
Yeah.
You probably wouldn't be surprised if you found out. You'd probably go, "Oh, yeah, right. That's a good description." But I find myself, there's a bit of me that is I like being enthusiastic rather than ripping into stuff. But then I get very angry when really sort of moderately good stuff. I don't mind bad stuff and I don't mind great stuff, but it's when sort of three-star stuff gets boosted. That's the bit that it's sort of like,
sure,
can't you guys see that this isn't, that it doesn't deserve this sort of stuff? But it's a constant debate in my head. I'm not sure.
Well, I think the best description I've ever heard of that sort of conflict or just sort of different schools of thought was this was a few years ago. Emily Vanderwerf wrote a thing where she was comparing. She said that there are just some critics who go in with a 5-star review and you have to talk them down.
Mm-hmm.
And there are some critics who go in with a 0-star review and you have to talk them up.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a very basic and an equally respectable way of approaching the job. And the thing that she said that I thought was so insightful was that, like, this was what made Siskel and Ebert such a good combination, because Ebert was a go in with the 5-star and Siskel was a go in with the 0-star. And so if it convinced both of them, then you really knew that you were onto something, which I think is true. And I will make no apologies about it. I am one of the former. I am but I was not always that way. And when I started, I certainly was looking for an opportunity to rip things up, because those are fun to write on a very basic sort of childish level. But as I did the work myself, I did very much come to appreciate the work that it takes, which is not to say, number one, that I am always a pushover. And there are times where I have felt the exact same emotion that you're talking about, of like, what are you people all going? This movie was totally fine. Like, because so much of what I see falls into totally fine, sometimes it really does have to be great to kick out of that. But I've also found that when I dislike a movie, I hate it with the fury of 1,000 suns, because I feel almost personally offended that they have wasted this incredible opportunity. And so often wasted it on doing something that is cynical and lazy and lowest common denominator. You know what I mean? Like that nothing about a film is more infuriating to me than that kind of cynicism. And it's all over major entertainment right now.
Right.
Like, it's all, you can't miss it these days. And so to a great extent, for me personally, I have to some extent, especially over the course of the pandemic, tuned out of a lot of the sort of mainstream stuff. A lot of the stuff that I freelance. I am assigned things. I'm no longer at a staff position where I'm obligated to see every new release and have an opinion on it. But I was for quite some time, and that is a hard inclination to shake. And so even up until the last couple of years, I still sort of, even if I wasn't reviewing something, I still felt like, well, I should see this, so I have something to say about it. And I found increasingly less obligation, personal, intellectual obligation to do that. Over the course of the pandemic, I just watched a lot of older stuff. I caught up on I filled some blind spots. I watched a lot of sort of older oddities. I just, I found that much more rewarding and much more fulfilling on a personal level, to just see things that were interesting to me, as opposed to seeing new things that I was quote unquote supposed to see.
No, absolutely. No, I totally agree. I think there's that every now and again. I think, do I really need to watch the Fast and Furious films? I mean, should I? I don't know. I was looking through one of the streaming services recently, and I couldn't find anything that I have either hadn't already seen or that piqued my interest, until I was sort of tweeting, do I need to see National Treasure? Would that be something to watch? It's just like, but I think if you've survived so long without it, I think you're probably okay.
You're fine. You're just fine.
It. When did you? When did you come up with the idea of the book then?
Well, it was. I can give you the long answer if you'd like to hear it, because it is a bit of a strange twist.
Sure. No, that's
journey.
That's what we're interested in.
Like I said, I'd always had this interest in New York cinema, and especially after I moved to New York. And if anything, I would say almost the book may have begun the day after we moved here, because the day after we moved, I had a job interview at CBS Broadcast headquarters, which is down on 57th Street. Just a little, freelance video editing job, just something to get us going. And so I went to that interview while my wife stayed home and unpacked. And then, and I took the subway by myself for the first time. And then I came back and, we decided just to watch a movie to unwind, because I'd done this and she'd been packing all day. And just sort of randomly, we selected 16 Blocks, which is a Richard Donner movie. Really terrific little, cop thriller, which is set in New York.
That's not with Bruce Willis, is it?
Bruce Willis and Mos Def and David Morse. About halfway through the movie, there's a scene where they are in a subway station, and I freaked out. I stood up and I was like, because I had been there that day, 3 hours before, I was like, that's the subway station I went through today to go to my interview. And she's like, oh, wow, cool. Like, she wasn't nearly as excited about it as I was, but I was just like, that's, when you grow up in Wichita, Kansas, you don't have the experience of seeing places that you have just been in, like, real movies. And we had a friend, my friend Mike Hull, who I make the podcast with now, who had lived here for, a few years, about 5 years before us, but a friend from back home in Kansas. And so I mentioned this experience to him the next day, and he said, oh yeah, he said, the thing my uncle told me before I moved here is you will suddenly start to see a lot of places you recognize from movies. And that became sort of a hobby of those first couple of years, was seeing New York movies and recognizing things, places that I passed in my daily life, and not just obvious things like Times Square or whatever, but just like, oh, here's this, this intersection on, over by NYU where I meet my wife after she gets out of school. But this is where, the cop car flipped in the climax of Pelham 123. Wow, that's cool. Now there's a Starbucks here, of course. So the idea of doing, and so I just knew there was something with that I wanted to do, and I didn't know what it was. And initially the idea had manifested itself because I hadn't quite talked myself down from the idea of being a filmmaker. Around this time, maybe a couple years after that, the art installation The Clock was playing in New York. Do you remember The Clock? Did you hear about The Clock?
Was that the one where there's a clip? It takes the time that's seen in every movie and puts them all together.
Yes, it's a 24-hour sort of looping video installation that is comprised entirely of like images of clocks or people saying the time or what time of day it is or whatever for a full 24 hours. It's this incredible project. And, I went to see some of it. I don't know anybody who sat through all 24 at least at a time, but I saw chunks of it when it was playing at the Museum of Modern Art around the same time. And so my original idea was that I would do a documentary film that was sort of in the way that was both a video and an actual working clock, a film that was both a video and a map of New York City that would be comprised entirely of clips from New York movies, and that you would kind of work your way through the city over the course of this film. And that these different New York movies would sort of interact with each other and clash with each other. And, Jimmy Cagney would turn a corner and Woody Allen would be there. Like, this was sort of the idea. I didn't make it very far into that idea. I just sort of started gathering movies. I just started gathering clips and thinking about the way that all of these movies over this history talked to each other. But around 2014, 2015, I found out about Executive Order number 10. And when I found out about that was somehow the combination of that and also sort of backing away from being a filmmaker and having written a couple of books by then, that became the moment where I realized, no, this is a book. That there's a written story to tell here, and that this one piece of paper is the sort of the hook for that entire story. And that piece of paper is Executive Order number 10, was signed by John Lindsay in May of 1966. And basically it is, I'll do the shortest possible version of this. In that document lay the entire, the past 50 plus years of New York City location shooting. Because before that, with the exception of, a brief period sort of at the beginning of the movies, but New York location shooting had been incredibly difficult because there was this sort of Byzantine, all of these permits, and you had to get like a different permit for every location and all of these forms. You had, there was all of this paperwork. Labor was much more expensive. Police were uncooperative and you had to like pay them off. Like, it was just incredibly hard to shoot a full movie in New York City. There were occasional exceptions and there were small films that pulled it off, but for the most part, the big New York movies of, from say 1920 through 1966 were primarily shot, even if they were set in New York, they were shot in California. They were shot on sort of New York street backlots in studios. Occasionally they would come out for like a few days to shoot exteriors and things like that to sort of fake it. But the difficulty of making a movie in New York prevented many of them from being made here. And John Lindsay, who was sort of a Hollywood candidate, like he was, this sort of young, dashing, matinee, idol, handsome, Kennedy-esque figure.
And yet Republican.
was a liberal Republican back in a moment when that existed, when that was a thing.
Yeah, now it's a Starbucks.
Yes. So he had campaigned with sort of celebrities, and at some point along the line had been made aware of this issue, and it had been talked about occasionally, and other mayors had made stabs at trying to make it work and had never really figured it out. But one of his campaign promises was that he was going to bring movies back to New York. And after he was elected in November of 1965, he sort of commissioned a couple of people to figure out how to make that happen. And their recommendations were basically verbatim in Executive Order Number 10. And what Executive Order Number 10 did was established the Mayor's Office of Film, Theater, and Broadcasting, which was a one-stop shop, which was a place where filmmakers could go for all the resources they would need. They would fill out one permit, they would get one signature, one red stamp, and have the help they needed to make a movie in a very complicated city. And it established, a division of the police that was specific, for this job. Like they would come be on your set and help you make your movie. And, and provisions for, matching of labor and all this sort of, it took care of all of the problems that had plagued New York movie making on a grand scale for decades. And so that's fascinating in and of itself. But then the other half of this, and why this in my head was a book, was a story that had to be told, was that, that's right at the beginning of the Lindsay administration. And then during Lindsay's 2 terms are basically when New York goes into the toilet, are when crime increases and social services decline, and, white flight decreases the tax revenues, and so the budgets get all out of whack. That's when the city enters its sort of sketchiest phase. And what I found really sort of glorious in its comic timing is the fact that because he had taken this incredible initiative at the beginning of his term, all of those failings were captured for the world to see in all of these New York movies. And if he hadn't made that effort, then we might not have known what a hellhole New York was in the 1970s. Were it not for Executive Order Number 10, Midnight Cowboy wouldn't exist as we know it. Taxi Driver wouldn't exist as we know it. The French Connection wouldn't exist as we know it. All of our image, because it was a very clear point of that memo that they would not interfere, that city government would have no censorial influence, that they did not have to approve of your script, but they would help you get it made. And so that comic timing to me was just like, well, there's a story there, and maybe there's a book there, and that was sort of how that began.
It's so funny, but it also kind of means that if New York was Zurich and the streets were clean and everything was perfect, then what's the point in filming that?
Right.
You kind of the growth of those New York movies happens about the same time as the sort of the petering out and the decline of the Western. So you sort of, it's almost like you're transferring one genre to another. And even the Paul Newman film, Fort Apache, The Bronx, right, makes that connection absolutely explicit.
Right, exactly. And so that's that flavor and that flair, and that it's an overused term when you're talking about New York movies of the 70s, but that grittiness, that sort of griminess is what gives those movies such personality, is what, again, drew me to them as like a 12-year-old. But it did also create kind of a PR nightmare that it took New York a very long time to overcome. And so that's part of the story too, and how that sort of, how they were in the 1980s, especially, attempting to run these very slick tourism campaigns. They decided, that one of the ways out of the fiscal hole was to reposition the city as a destination for tourists. But they're doing that at the same time as, movies like Ms. 45 and The Exterminator are coming out. And so there's that very interesting tension there, which I wanted to explore. So I had that idea for the book, but I didn't really know more than that. And so I just sort of sat on that for a year or so as I was working on other projects and writing a couple of other books, but sort of increasing, seeing more films and reading more things and thinking about it. But then the hooks, the way that the film sort of took the way that the book took the structure that it took on was this whole other series of complications, because I went to my agent with this idea finally in 2017. Just, this idea of a book about, and initially I envisioned it as being covering 25 years, covering, from the signing of Executive Order Number 10 in 1966 up to around 1990, because the 90s are sort of, as we all know, when the city sort of cleaned itself up. So focusing on that 25-year stretch and envisioning it initially as, sort of a conventional nonfiction, regular size, maybe a photo section in the middle, but that kind of a book. My agent, Daniel Greenberg, said, well, that's a good idea, but if you're going to sell this to a publisher, you got to have a more recognizable hook. You got to have some sort of thing for the casual browsing viewer to sink their teeth into, because nobody's heard of Executive Order Number 10. But, is there a movie that you can hook this to and tell the story, sort of on parallel tracks? And it had always been my intention to do kind of dual history, but the idea of making it that explicit was a new one. And I said, well, one movie for 25 years is a little, kind of minimizes what we can do. And he said, okay, well, what are some other strategies that we could use? And we together came up with, the initial idea was to still cover those 25 years, but to go with the three mayors of those 25 years, to break it into those three sections. So John Lindsay, Abe Beame, Ed Koch. And then pick one movie that sort of was the definitive movie of their era. And he said, if you've got those three movies, we can put those on the cover, we can put those on the back, and, and there you go. And so that was, the concept. And we started, to shop it around. Simultaneously, I had been in talks with Abrams Books, because my friend Matt Zoller Seitz has written a bunch of books for them, and he referred me to his editor, Eric, and said, I think you guys would work well together. And Matt, to his credit, was right about that. But I had been thinking in terms of the kind of books Abrams makes, which are these very, big, handsome, illustrated kind of coffee table books, but with very thick texts. Matt is not a surface writer. So these are very, dense studies of these directors and scenes and stuff like that. And Eric and I had been working on an idea for an oral history of the indie film scene of the 1990s, which, as I mentioned before, was very important to me. It was, I was very plugged into at the time and had read all the books about and so forth, and had this idea of sort of talking to everyone who was involved in writing an oral history that would be then, a big splashy illustrated volume. And we had started working on that, and we had lined up some pretty big names for interviews, and we're kind of chugging right along. But this is the fall of 2017, and then the Harvey Weinstein stories started to come out. And immediately we started not getting confirmations of interviews that we were lining up. The asks were coming back because, understandably, nobody at that moment, especially those who were involved with Miramax, which dominated that scene.
Explaining football to the friend who's just there for the nachos? Hard. Tailgating from home like a pro with snacks and drinks everyone will love? An easy win. And with Instacart helping deliver the snack time MVPs to your door, you're ready for the game in as fast as 30 minutes. So you never miss a play or lose your seat on the couch or have to go head-to-head for the last chicken wing. Shop Game Day Faves on Instacart and enjoy $0 delivery fees on your first 3 grocery orders. Offer valid for a limited time. Other fees and terms apply. This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. You chose to hit play on this podcast today. Smart choice. Make another smart choice with Auto Quote Explorer to compare rates from multiple car insurance companies all at once. Try it at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy.
Wanted to talk about that right then. And it also immediately became clear to us that maybe, the kind of celebratory volume that this was, we had initially envisioned this to be, that would be wildly inappropriate considering what we now know. So we shelved that book. It was just in proposal stage, but we were just like, this is not the book we're going to do right now. So let's figure out something else to work on. And this was around the time that, that my agent and I had come upon this idea. And again, initially I hadn't envisioned it as an Abrams type of book, but then I started thinking of it as maybe it would be. That, that in terms of telling this story, you're talking about the way that these movies capture the image of the city, and that might be something you would want illustrated more than I had originally had in mind. And so I just sort of ran it by Eric. I said, I don't know if this is an Abrams book or not, but blah, blah, blah. He said, send me over your proposal. And I sent over the proposal. And he said, let me take it to my board. And so he took it to his board and he came back to me and he said, okay, so I have, this is a two-part.
Good news and bad news.
Yes, exactly. Which do you want to hear first? And I said, well, the good news, of course. He said, the good news is they're interested in the book. They'd like you to write the book. I said, great. He said, but they would like it to cover 100 years, 10 chapters, each chapter covering a decade and focusing on one film the way that we had, instead of these mayoral administration structure, let's do it like this. And my immediate answer was yes, of course, because when you're selling a book, it's like whatever version of this you want, all right, especially having lived with it for that long. But, I did not really think about what that was going to mean in terms of how much longer it would take to write and research something that was now covering three times as much history as I had initially had in mind. But they know how to sell a book, and that was the idea that that was the idea that they could market. And I said, okay. And so we made a deal and I signed the contract and I wrote that book, and that's the book that you read.
And it looks amazing. It is absolutely brilliant in terms of the I think there's these dismissive sort of coffee table book sort of, but I think Abrams purveyors of absolute quality editions.
Yeah.
They look wonderful.
Yeah, their graphics team, their design team is just top notch and are really tuned in with what you're trying to put across as an author, and laying it out in a way that complements rather than compromises the text, which I think is really important.
And I like the idea. I mean, as interesting as your initial proposal was, I think you apply that sort of methodology of the parallel history so well to other things as well. So, for instance, one bit that I really loved was the King Kong story of them building the different skyscrapers at the say, and they're sort of like deciding which of the skyscrapers should the monster climb. Right. I just thought that was a really interesting. It just never occurred to me. Of course, this it wasn't like these buildings were there for decades and decades before King Kong. They were brand new. This was
yes.
It reminds me of Dracula. Sort of, why does Dracula go to London? Well, London is modernity. It's the center of modernity at that point, and Dracula's this old thing. And so why does King Kong have to go to New York? Well, it's the same idea. It's take something very, very old to something very, very new.
Yeah.
I thought that those sections were just super. I really made me look at the films in a way that was totally different, but also made me want to come back to the city and look at those places again.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, that honestly ended up being the trickiest part of that expanded scope, was just, that I was suddenly coming up against limited amounts of space. And in the research, I was coming across so many fascinating stories. For example, to follow the example that you're using, the story of the skyscraper race in New York City, which I too had never been aware of until I started researching that period and finding, in every chapter I tried to find a main character, a single person who's introduced on page 1 of the chapter, who we follow all the way through and see the city and the movie through their eyes. And that was a direct suggestion, bit of advice, incredible bit of guidance from my editor, Eric, who I wrote the first 3 chapters and knew the book wasn't working. Right. I just knew it was all over the place and it wasn't, cohering in the way that I needed it to, in the way I felt that it should in my mind. And I sent him those 3 chapters. I said, Eric, normally I would never send it to you this rough, but I need help here. And that was the one thing he came back to me with. He said, you don't have a main character in each chapter and you need one. We have to have someone if we're going to go on this long of a journey, we have to have someone to follow for at least short periods. So every chapter had to have that. And sometimes it's a filmmaker, sometimes it's an actor, sometimes it's a politician. And each chapter had to have at least one sort of New York story of that era that lined up with the movie. And so then for each chapter, I had to go find that story. In a lot of cases, I didn't know it. But in the case of the King Kong chapter, yeah, that entire story of the skyscraper race in New York City in the early 1930s, which is like an insane thing to have happening at the beginning of the Depression. Like these are, were buildings that were devised and planned, before the stock market crashed. And yet these guys were going to see it through, even though by the time these buildings went up, there weren't people there, there were not businesses to fill them. But that story is told in a terrific book called Higher, which I read, cover to cover, devoured, and then had to like boil that incredible book length story into a few pages of a chapter of another book. And so that ultimately ended up being one of the real challenges of writing the book, was sitting down at the beginning with the sort of total word count that Eric had given me, breaking up how many, what my word count would need to be for each chapter and for the sort of side essays and stuff like that, researching, and then sitting down to write each chapter and like watching that word count slowly, going into the rear view, because I had found out so much that I wanted to tell. There were so many stories to share.
And then you do the pass where you go, right, I'm getting rid of all my adjectives.
Yes. Exactly.
Contractions all count as one word, right? So
yes. 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 All quotes are irrelevant at this point. Yes. Yes, yeah. Exactly.
Was there ever like a period in one of the sort of chapters where you, I mean, I didn't feel it when I was reading it, but that you sort of struggled to find a story that, would connect and overlap well with the history of the movies?
I did, sort of in retrospect. The trickiest the trickiest chapter is the first full chapter, because the movie for the 1920s is The Jazz Singer. And with The Jazz Singer, you're just opening up such a can of worms, because there's all of this racist imagery in it. And you have to decide if you want to deal with that. And I briefly sort of entertained other ideas. There's a wonderful movie from a couple years later called Applause, which is one of the side essays which I wrote about, which is a far better movie and is burdened with none of that imagery. But I ultimately realized that the stories that are sort of secondary to that movie are, number one, that it's an immigrant story, and that so much of the city in that era was about that, and that this has been the struggle that film historians have had to deal with for decades now. The fact that it is, the first partial synchronous sound dialogue. I mean, it's not the first movie with sound, which is what it's been reduced to, but it was a groundbreaking technical achievement. And the more I was reading about New York in the 1920s, the more it became clear that that the idea of New York as a center of media and innovation culture was so the story that had to be told. And the idea that I had that this talking movie, this early revolutionary talking movie, was set in New York and filmed at least in part here, that I had to just wrestle with the fact that I was going to pick this thorny movie because it was the only one that made sense in terms of also telling a bit of history. If I were going to tell a reader one 1920s New York movie to watch, it would be Applause, or it would be The Crowd. It would not be The Jazz Singer, which by most, even beyond, the blackface in it, is also not a great movie. It's a very corny, hoary melodrama, but...
Yeah, Al Johnson's very specific, isn't it?
Yes, he sure is. He was a stage actor first and foremost. But it aligned so cleanly with what I wanted to do in the book that I had to be like, we're going to roll up our sleeves and we're going to deal with it as best we can. And understand that we're talking about it as an artifact and as a technical achievement, and not endorsing certainly those elements of it. I don't know if that was the answer to your question or not, but that's. Yeah.
No, that's absolutely. That's really interesting, because it is that thing of sort of, what to some degree you want to promote films, whenever you write a book about films, you want people to watch more films. And then at the same time, the history is telling you, well, actually this film is important, and it might not necessarily be that good a film, but it is important. So that's sort of why
the now playing essays at the end of each chapter were so important to me. Whereas, that if I am in a situation where, the main focal film is maybe not the absolute tip top of that era, at least at the end of each chapter, I've got a couple more recommendations. I've got some, it's sort of a watch list of some other films that really genuinely are worth seeking out, and in that chapter, like I said, it's Applause, it's The Crowd, Harold Lloyd's Speedy, and Buster Keaton's The Cameraman, all of which are great movies. So
I love as well that from that very first chapter, there's the idea of the methodology of filming in New York is sort of disguising the camera and trying to get as much genuine interaction into the film as possible. And that same methodology is being used with Midnight Cowboy in the late 60s. And they're still, it's the same idea. Let's just put it in a box and you guys just act, and we'll have a long lens, and we'll try to get it.
Yeah, it was one of the recurring themes of the entire, all the way up until, Larry Clark was doing that on Kids in the 90s. Everyone, because when part of what you are, when you're choosing to shoot on location in New York, it's not just about being in Times Square and seeing, the New York Times news zipper or whatever. It's about the way that it's about the combination of people and vehicles and just the buzz of a New York City street. And so if you can, you don't want to have to stage that. You want to grab it as naturally as you can. But yeah, all the way through the book, it's I kept coming across vignettes or, little anecdotes where, and the quote from the cinematographer is well, we decided to hide the camera in a bread truck and and it's that's just, it's a constant. And I found that actually very charming, that there have been huge advances in technology, obviously for filmmaking over the past 100 years, but they all just kept going back to just hiding the camera in a box somewhere on the street.
It's always a bread truck.
Yep.
Get some other kind of truck, guys, just for variety. What about in terms of more recent years, because you go up right up to, I think the last film in the book is Hidden Gems. Is it Hidden Gems, or am I saying that
Uncut
right?
Gems.
Uncut Gems. God, Hidden Gems. Bloody hell.
No, it's okay.
It's not exactly a hidden gem. Uncut Gems is pretty well known, I think, as well.
Yes.
But have there been even more recent films that you're looking at and you're thinking, right, give it a couple of years, next edition that's going in?
Right. I guess for the structure of the book, we'd have to do another edition in 10 years, which for the record, I'm fine with. Yeah. But the two things that I have just had to come to terms with over, the past year or so after we kind of closed the book out was that, number one, I'm going to continue seeing new movies that I wish had come out in time for the book. And the most recent examples of that I have are the most In the Heights, frankly, was supposed to have come out right around the time that I would have been gathering art. So I would have loved to have, because it's such a, I wrote the book while I was living in Washington Heights. And that movie so beautifully captures the look and feel of that neighborhood. Just yesterday, I went to a New York Film Festival screening of Mike Mills's Come On, Come On. A huge chunk of that is in New York. Gorgeous black and white cinematography. It's some images I would have loved to have put into the book. So I've come to terms with, number one, great New York movies are going to keep coming out that I'm going to wish were in there. And number two, it was a huge, I watched over 300 movies for the book, over the course of 3 years. I watched a lot of stuff, and I still didn't watch everything. There are still a few that I just never made my way to. And for the rest of my life, I am also going to continue to see movies that came out in the 70s and 80s that I had missed, that I wasn't aware were New York movies, that I'm going to kick myself for not putting in the book. And the most recent example of that for me was a couple of months ago. I watched The Gambler for the first time with James Caan, which is a very 70s New York thing that I just, for whatever reason, had no idea had been shot in New York, missed it entirely. That's just going to be, that's just going to be the rest of my life. I thought it was LA for some reason, but I'm coming to peace with this knowledge that the book was as comprehensive as it could be in 3 years. And I'll continue to see things. And you're right. Maybe in 8 or so, 9 years, Eric will, ring me up and say, okay, we're ready to add the 2020s chapter. And I will be ready.
I think that sounds perfectly reasonable, personally. Were there any movies that you watched and that are sort of filmed and predominantly set in New York and all the rest of it that you feel don't get the city, because there are some filmmakers like you use Shame as a good example, which is, I think, is a great film, and the creative team are entirely or British, Welsh, Irish, German. Is there examples of people who just don't seem to get the city, or you're sort of less than convinced by?
I think the Shame is really an interesting example, because it was the same thing with Midnight Cowboy, where that was a film from a British director and a Polish cinematographer, his first director photography credit. And yeah, I think sometimes with those films, the outsider eye sees things that, your native New York filmmaker might take for granted. Which I think is a really interesting phenomenon. But sometimes the outsider just doesn't key into the city. And it's a very sort of surface representation. I don't have a lot of examples, but the one that leaps to mind, because we just did a sort of a comprehensive deep dive of it on our podcast, is Death Wish.
Right, Michael Winner.
Yeah, a British director who came to New York, who went to the trouble of shooting Death Wish in New York, but it doesn't really feel much like New York. And in New York critics at the time said, I think Vincent Canby wrote that it was a New York film made by tourists, that the urban spaces don't feel populated, that the interiors feel like they could be anywhere. And then, sort of as if to prove that point, Michael Winner shoots Death Wish 3, which is set in New York, entirely in London, and all of his New York street thugs, Alex Winter, who's in Death Wish 3, pointed out to us, are all these they look like British longshoremen. They're all these guys in little stocking caps and green jackets and whatever. They look nothing like New Yorkers. So I think that outsider eye is tricky. It can be it can give, but it can also just miss things entirely, I think.
Yeah, Michael Winner is something of a terrible hack. It has to be
yes.
said.
Yes, he is.
God almighty. Have you ever seen Bullseye?
I have not. Oh, no.
It's Roger Moore and Michael Caine, and it's just awful. There's a lot. I think the high point is a farting dog. I mean, it's that kind of movie.
Yeah. One of our guests on that episode, our friend Matt Perget, said Michael Winner's entire style can be summarized as, I have dinner reservations at 7.
I think he would agree with that. I think Michael Winner would be the first person to say, yep, that's exactly right. He was a very I'm not sure what's the word, gourmand. He loved his food. Yes. I remember I had a Twitter application. A Twitter interaction with him a few years ago, where it was just a silly thing that he's always going on about food, and I just tweeted him out of the blue, what are you having for breakfast, Michael? And he just went, raspberries. That was that's just one morning where Michael Winner, the director of Death Wish, decided to interact with me. But that's an interesting point. I saw it very recently, Death Wish. I mean, very, very recently, about a year or so ago. So, it's pretty much, it's one of those movies you kind of want to have a bath afterwards.
But not a great movie by any stretch, but certainly an influential one, and certainly one that offered a lot of fodder for what I was trying to do in this book. I saw it for the first time in 2017 when I was just starting to research the book at a theatrical screening. Film Forum was doing one of their periodic, New York movie series, and I saw it for the first time there. And I don't think there was a film where I took more notes throughout the entire process than the many things I scrawled in the dark all the way through Death Wish. It's a fascinating, terrible movie.
Yeah. And I mean, there's so many movies that were made around that time that, we remember Taxi Driver, but, you bring up Joe as well, which is a Peter Boyle film that is just ferociously right-wing and ferociously vengeful against the 60s and any sense of liberalism or what they see as decadence, essentially, what is seen as decadence. Yeah, and you connected it, I think, to the hard hats, which again is another thing that seems to get forgotten a little bit. I mean, Ken Burns, his Vietnam documentary was the first time I'd ever heard of it. The demonstration in New York of the sort of construction workers and the sort of essentially a pro-war or an anti-war.
Yeah, it was. I'm a little steeped in that right now because we have an upcoming episode of the podcast that's about that moment, about Joe and the Hard Hat riots and so forth, which frankly now read as a really sort of chilling precursor to the Capitol riots in January of this year over here. But yeah, I mean that was well, and I think too that's also an interesting dichotomy because that was a film that was made by, ostensibly liberal filmmakers, but that had this key character who was this very reactionary, who they intended as a villain, and then who a portion of the audience did not see that way. A sort of a similar pickle to, what Scorsese and Schrader found themselves with Travis Bickle a few years later. And that is, where that's a conversation we're still having about cinema and about art and about depiction and endorsement and all of those sorts of things, that if you really want to get into the darkness with these characters, you're always risking lionizing them in some way. I don't think either of those films do, but I can certainly see how a certain predisposed member of the audience might read them that way.
But they even released an album of Joe just ranting.
Yes.
15 of his most racist rants.
Yes, that part's pretty indefensible. Yes, that is... Yeah, but Joe, was initially called the Gap, and that character, focusing on the generation gap between two of the other characters in the film, the middle class businessman that he befriends and that man's daughter, who's the sort of hippie runaway. In the 2 months between the Hard Hat riots and the release of the film, they retitled it Joe. They sort of repositioned the supporting character as a lead character, and they put him front and center on the poster, with a shotgun in one hand and an American flag in the other. And the tagline was, "Keep America Beautiful," which has some uncomfortable echoes now. So yeah, it's, all of these things are cyclical, and they're all weirdly sort of interconnected in ways that I wasn't expecting.
And what are you going to go on and work on next? Have you got another project in mind, or are you just recovering?
I'm promoting and recovering pretty actively, and I have 2 proposals that are out now, but have I'm waiting. I'm in that same place again, waiting to hear back from Pub Board, from editorial people, with either approvals or rejections or complete rethinkings. But I have 2 that are out. One that's sort of in similar vein to this, although not quite as labor and time intensive, and then also the possibility of a biography, which I won't get into the specifics of, but was an idea that was floated to do a biography, and is something I might have been more dismissive of had I not just read Mark Harris's Mike Nichols book, which for me sort of presents rethinks what a film biography can be, and sort of the kind of depth that you can get into in that form, which I take as kind of an interesting challenge. So hopefully one of those will go somewhere.
Excellent. Well, my final question for you, Jason, is of course, what book are you going to recommend? Just one rule I'm going to lay down. I usually don't lay down any rules, but you're not allowed to recommend Mark Harris's Mike Nichols biography, because otherwise people will talk.
It's just a loop. It's just a feedback loop if we do that. And I get that. Actually, the book that I'm reading right now, that I'm really enjoying, and I'm not, I just cracked into it a couple of days ago, but it's terrific, is it's called These Fists Break Bricks by Grady Hendrix and Chris Pagliali, who I worked with on a sort of a silly little mockumentary project a couple of years ago. But I picked this up when I was in Austin at Fantastic Fest, and they were there doing signings and doing some screenings. And it's a wonderful sort of history of the martial arts movie boom of the 1970s and the 1980s. Like this one is a bit of an art book. It's, it's beautifully laid out. It's from Mondo Books. And so the design is impeccable. Lots of great, posters and, grimy little newspaper ads and still images from these films. But again, a really dense, well-researched text. I mean, these guys are sort of mind-bogglingly knowledgeable on exploitation cinema in general, but on kung fu movies in particular. And so really laying down the trends, what was happening in culture that these movies were responding to, what the audiences were for them, and also tying them into sort of concurrent cultural movements like, the early days of hip hop and breakdancing, and, how that audience and this one sort of crossed over. The RZA from Wu-Tang writes the introduction, which kind of tells you all you need to know about the cachet of this volume. But I'm enjoying it quite a bit and learning a lot that I didn't know about these movies.
Is it giving you plenty to put on your watch list?
Yeah. I'm going to have to, I always, that's the danger of reading too many film books is you just end up with this like unmanageable watch list, this teetering stack of discs to conquer. But yes, I'm lining up at least, a couple of months of relaxation and watching some things for pleasure. And then probably, after the new year, hopefully I'll have a new book to start working on.
Brilliant. Well, listen, Jason, thank you so much for talking to me about your new book, which is called Fun City Cinema.
Fun City Cinema, New York City and the Movies That Made It, which is the subtitle. It's out October 26th from Abrams Books. And Fun City Cinema is also the title of our podcast, which is currently in its second season and available wherever you get your podcasts. It's a nonfiction narrative storytelling podcast, really highly densely produced, where we interweave archival audio and film clips and new interviews from filmmakers and film critics and historians of all stripes, and we're really proud of that as well.
I'll link to both things in the show notes as well, so people can get to them quickly and easily. Although, admittedly, if you listen to this podcast, then you go over and you listen to Jason's, you're only going to be disappointed because the production values of my podcast are exemplary.
You're very kind.
As you can see from the high-tech equipment that I have before me. No, but honestly, Jason, it's a real pleasure to talk to you, and it's really great to have a recommended author on the Writers on Film podcast.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much for having me, seriously.
So that was my conversation with Jason Bailey. I hope you enjoyed it. It was fascinating to talk to him and really interesting. Made me want to go back to New York, which I fully intend to do as soon as this is financially and global pandemically possible. And until then, you could do much worse than read his new book, Fun City Cinema, New York and the films that made it, and movies that made it, and in a way sort of viscerally get into the city in that way. His recommended book, These Fists Break Bricks, How Kung Fu Movies Swept America and Changed the World, by Grady Hendrix and Chris Poggiani, is available everywhere, and I shall certainly be having a look at that. I'm a big fan of Kung Fu movies. Thanks very much to Elliot Atkins and for the music, and Ali Harwood for the artwork, and thanks very much for listening. Until the next episode, take care.
Shorter days and chillier nights can make it tough to keep up your fall workout routine. Thankfully, there's Alo Moves, the app that brings health and wellness to the comfort of your home. Alo Moves offers yoga, Pilates, strength workouts, and other fitness classes, plus wellness offerings like meditations, sound baths, and more. Whether you have 5 minutes or an hour, Alo Moves has a class or flow that saves you from a frigid trip to the gym. Get a 30-day free trial and 20% off an annual membership with code ACAST at allomoves.com.
1-800-Flowers.com knows that a gift is never just a gift. A gift is an expression of everything you feel and helps build more meaningful relationships. 1-800-Flowers takes the pressure off by helping you navigate life's important moments by making it simple to find the perfect gift. From flowers and cookies to cake and chocolate, 1-800-Flowers helps guide you in finding the right gift to say how you feel. To learn more, visit 1-800-Flowers.com/ACAST. That's 1-800-Flowers.com/ACAST.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.